Good evening, everybody. Good to see you again. We mentioned on Wednesday night that it was turning cold, and it stayed fairly true to that for the past 4 days. And then unfortunately, at least in my eyes, we got the added component of cold rain today. So I hope that you were able to stay inside, stay out of the elements, remain warm and dry, because I don't know about you, but the only thing worse than being cold is being cold and wet at the same time. So I hope that you were able to avoid that today. It's part of the time of year in which we're in now. It's part of the beginning of the ending portion of our autumn season, going into our winter season, if you can call what we have here in Florida seasons. But on the bright side, one of the best events that you can view kicked off today. The World Cup started in Qatar today, and it's going to go on for the next few weeks. I don't know if you're like myself, but I'm of the very, very firm opinion that professional soccer, particularly international soccer played by professionals, is one of the most entertaining sporting events that there is. So if you're not familiar with that, I suggest that you tune in at some point. It's going to be wildly entertaining if you like sports at all. And it is just getting kicked off today. But regardless of how your afternoon went, I'm glad that we're here. I'm glad that we've chosen to be here together again today to study the book of Ecclesiastes, to continue our study titled Beyond the Hevel, to help see past the Hevel that is in our lives and look past our time under the sun and to the other side of eternity, so to speak. On Wednesday evening, we concluded our look at the portion of the text that we were referring to as the experiment, the portion of the text that went from the last half of chapter 1 through the ending of chapter 2. And in that we saw that the preacher, the voice in Ecclesiastes, looking for significance and meaning and happiness through his life, did so through many different avenues, trying to enhance the things that are given to us in this life and to make them something that they are not, to try to build upon them. And the conclusion that we ultimately saw him come to is that those things as they are, those things that as they are given to us, are ultimately what give us meaning and happiness and satisfaction in life. Those are the things at which we toil. The toil itself is what we should enjoy, not what that toil may provide us. The things that are given to sustain us is partaking in those things. That is the joy-providing thing that we are looking for. So tonight, we're going to see this built upon. We're going to begin our look at chapter 3. We're going to take time tonight and Wednesday night to look at chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes. The third chapter of Ecclesiastes, in my mind, has two distinct sections, and they complement one another very well. And we're going to look mainly at the first portion of that tonight and then conclude that on Wednesday evening looking at the second half. The first portion is an 8-verse poem, an 8-verse section written in the poetic form that explains the seasons of life that we will encounter while here under the sun. And then the remainder of that chapter, verses 9 through 22, are going to be this powerful sentiment expressed to us through prose in contrast to the poetic form of the opening of the chapter. And this is going to be a very important piece for us to look at mainly on Wednesday night, because the verses in verse 9 through verse 22, they really provide the framework for what verses 1 through 8 are going to tell us. Tonight we're going to look mainly, as I said, at verses 1 through 8, and we're going to see what those are highlighting about the seasons of our life. And then Wednesday evening, we're going to use the remainder of the book to really bring those things into focus. And before we do that, one reminder that we're going to see highlighted throughout this chapter particularly is the three lenses that we're looking at the book of Ecclesiastes through, right? The three things that we've been talking about throughout our study together and will continue to talk about, and that is we are looking at these three themes throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. That is, one, who is ultimately in control. Two, are things a gain of our own volition or a gift from God. And then thirdly, living with the end in sight. So using our death and the preparation for our death to forge how we live a happy and bountiful life while here on this earth. So there is where we're going to head tonight. And before we get there, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Father, we come to you tonight, again, so thankful for you loving us and being our provider and our caretaker. We thank you for all the good things that you've given us to enjoy in this life. We thank you for the time that we have together tonight to study your word. We thank you for the time that we had together this morning as a church family to worship you, to praise you, to meditate on the sacrifice that Christ made for us, and in doing all this, able to edify one another and lift each other up. We ask that you will help us to use the things that we're able to do today to help us face the world around us in the coming days. And Father, most of all, we thank you for Jesus and the sacrifice that he made on our behalf so that we could have a home with you after we live our life here under the sun. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so I'd like to go ahead and read a portion of the book. We're going to start in verse 1. We're going to read through verse 15 to start with. And then we're going to jump out of the text to do an exercise that I hope will help us get a better understanding of what is being said. I know it helps me, and I hope it'll translate to you. And then we're going to go back and focus on the first 8 verses of this chapter and see the things that they are highlighting for us about our lives. So starting in verse 1 of chapter 3. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart. Yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end, I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. So I want to, before we jump back into this text and start to dissect it and see exactly what it's pointing to, I want to give you a little insight into a portion of my life that helps me put this in a perspective that helps me to understand it. So you may or may not know, but I am in the construction industry. I have been in the construction industry for the majority of my adult life, which as of a year or two ago started to translate in that I have been in the construction industry longer than I have not. That's a hard reality to face the day you face it, but it's come and gone, so it's just a fact now, right? But the point of that is, for the majority of my life, a portion of at least every single day, there's been a minimum of one thought come to my mind that's been in direct reference to some project that was going on in my life. I've been a part of one particular construction project or another for that long of a time. Savannah would be able to tell you that it is a large portion of my life based on the fact that anytime we drive anywhere, I will see something that I had a small role in building, whether it be a very, very small project or something to a grand scale, and I will point it out. And then I will tell her about it. And then I'll point it out the next time we drive by, and the next time, and the next time. And unfortunately for her, the times that we visit my parents in Alabama, it gets really bad really quick. She doesn't want to get in the car with me to go anywhere. But the point is, I don't do that out of a sense of pride. And there is a sense of pride that comes along with completing certain things in this life, whether it's a construction project or otherwise. But I do that because when I see these things that I have been a part of, what immediately comes to my mind is the amount of complexity that went into these things that were beyond anything that I could personally do, though my portion of that project was key into it becoming completed, no matter how large or small my role was. This building is the Cancer Research and Treatment Center at DCH Regional Hospital in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. It was where I spent a portion of 2.5 years of my life, and it was a multi-million-dollar project, and I was fortunate enough to be on the team that was responsible for all of the structural concrete that was being put in place. So we were responsible for basically building the skeleton on which everything else would sit. This is a complex structure, even if it's a standalone building. However, it also had to tie into a parking deck and have bridges at every level. We had to then extend the parking deck. We had to extend the ICU, and then we had to build a tunnel underneath to attach it to the main building. So just in the portion of this project that my team was a part of, things were complex. But as you can see in the picture, concrete is not the only part of this project. There's landscaping, there's windows, there's site work, masonry, electrical, HVAC, plumbing, and the list goes on and on. So how do we all get to the point where we are doing our part in these projects? And the fact is that we all get blueprints, sets of plans that are multiple pages that look very similar to what you see on the screen there. So we get these because, as you know, no one has ever accused me, and most of the people that I work with, of being a rocket surgeon, as they say. That's just not happening. Not one of us is going to be able to freestyle, so to speak, and build this structure. There are certain things that have to be used, certain materials that have to be used. There are prescriptions for the way in these materials are joined together. There are prescriptions for the sequencing of these things being placed. And while I know how to do my portion based on the timing and descriptions that someone else has given me, I have no idea how the rest of that project functions in correlation to what I'm doing, but I know that when I put my piece in place in the proper time and everybody else puts their piece in place in the proper time, things will come together and you will get a building like we saw a few moments ago. Excuse me. Now, I know that a lot of you have never been involved in a construction project such as that, but quick show of hands, how many of you have ever received maybe the most dreaded phone call that you can possibly receive that says, "Hey, I'm on my way home. I am leaving IKEA." I don't know about you, but if I get that phone call, it's bad news for me. And it's very similar, though, on a much smaller scale, because when you get given the box for whatever it is, a bed, a desk, a nightstand, you're going to open it up and you're going to get a set of instructions. And there's going to be a picture of it. But then on top of that, there's going to be a box that's a third of the size of whatever it is that you've been tasked to build by whomever is tasking you. So much like the other project, when I go to build something from IKEA, and please don't take this as a bashing of IKEA as a whole, there have been many pieces of IKEA furniture passed through my house over the years. I can see the materials, I can see what they're supposed to be, and I can see these little dinky wrenches and like 1,000 fasteners, and they're not real screws. I don't even know what they are. And I have no idea, without that manual, how to put it together, right? So whether you're building something from IKEA or you're building a multi-million-dollar cancer center, there is a time and place for you to play your part and for you to do the things that you are to do. And sometimes we have the knowledge of when those are coming, and sometimes that knowledge is from someone else. And we may be able to see it, and we may not. And that's why when you play your individual part, you're not the person designing the whole project. You're not the person running the site. That has been left to someone else. It seems that life is going to be similar by reading this version, or this chapter in Ecclesiastes. In a sense, although it's not an apples-to-apples correlation, there is a time and place for all things. However, I may not know exactly what they are. The biggest difference, in my opinion, of building a project and how our lives unfold is that we don't have a complete blueprint like we did for the cancer center of what will go where and when it will be placed. But we do have the pieces in our hands that have been given to us, and we have the information revealed to us by God to do our part. We are building with the information that we have been given, but there is much about our life that we can't control. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, these are the ideas that we're going to see played out. In chapter 1, first off, as we read in the first 8 verses, this is not a choose-your-own-adventure book. When I was in elementary school, we had a book fair twice a year. I don't know what they called it down here, but for us it was a book fair. They brought in a bunch of books on these little portable shelves. They put them in the library, and some point of the week, your class got to go, and you could bring $5 and walk out with like 38 books. It was really amazing. And when I was in elementary school, the hottest commodity was the choose-your-own-adventure book, which means you read to page 15, and at the bottom of page 15, you get an option. You can do this by going to page 18, or you can do this by going to page 23. I always chose the one that got me the furthest along in the book, and it was a hard day when I realized that some of those pages were actually going to send you backwards in the book as well. But the fact is that that's not how life is. We don't get to choose, and we see that being highlighted here in the first 8 verses of this book. In chapter 1, we were given an explanation of how we can't escape the cycles of creation we are a part of, and that we are simply a part of one of those cycles. In chapter 2, we were shown that the pursuits we often chase during the cycle ultimately give no lasting satisfaction. But here in chapter 3, we're going to see the big picture of life as a whole, and the small picture, the seasons of life, brought together. We will see that our lack of control over these things are actually good news and are precisely what will give us hope and understanding, and we will see that more clearly on Wednesday night. We are all building our own projects or our lives, but we aren't in complete control. We are writing them within the confines allowed by God, allowed by our Creator. In regard to living a life well lived and pleasing to God, chapter 3 is going to make 2 things very clear. The first of those is that we are limited by the constraint of time, and we are bound by that on our lives here under the sun. But the second thing that's going to be made very clear is that God is not. As we will read and look into more further, the things that God does endure forever. And again, it's a beautiful poem that is written. So beautiful at times, it is often quoted at funerals that we attend, whether the person whose funeral it is was Christian or otherwise. But often when that's the case, this verse quits being quoted at verse 8. And as we will see, if we only study through verse 8 or use verse 8 and then stop without looking at the rest of the chapter, we are not allowing ourselves to view this section of the text through the framework that was intended by the author. So again, the opening is a poem. I know we just read it a few moments ago, so I'm not going to take the time to read the whole thing again, but here it is as we discuss a few portions about it. When we read the poem in the beginning of the book, the one that we read at chapter 1, we discussed the impact that the fact that it was written poetically had. Does anybody remember what some of those benefits or impacts were from chapter 1 being written in that format? Yeah, so as Barry said, there's a rhythm to it. There's a lyrical flow to it, and that helps us to ingrain it in our memories, much like a song. As I think I said that I can read something a million times and not quote it back to you, but if you play your favorite song for me 3 times, there's a good chance that I can sing the majority of it back. So that's one of them. And the other one I would say is, secondly, that the ebb and flow of the verses that we see here in the screen helped to point out in chapter 1, and as they do here, the ebb and flow of the cycles of nature in chapter 1 and the seasons of our life here in chapter 3. In verse 1 and 2, we see the big picture laid out for us. It says, "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die." So we're getting the large picture of life pointed out to us very early on. But then the following verses in this poem are going to show us the truth that in life there is a season for everything painted very clearly in this section of text. So we see themes like a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to keep silent and a time to speak, and so on. So after the large macro picture of life and death is given to us at the beginning, the rest of this poem shows us that the different activities that we will likely encounter during our time in this temporary home. And again, I think we mentioned in regards to the authorship of the book, when we consider the fact that it was possibly written by someone other than Solomon, using this royal fictional biography that was so popular in the ancient Near East. This type of poetic writing, this format was also popular, and the thing that I think is important to note is it'll give you these 2 points on a spectrum, but those 2 points are intended to express those 2 points, but also everything in between, right? So you have a time to born and a time to be die, which then encompasses the rest of our time here. A time to cast away and a time to gather stones and everything that would come in between. But there doesn't appear to be a lack, there does appear to be a lack of chronological structure to the words that we see here in verses 1 through 8. We're told about all of these different things that are going to come. There are times for all of these things. But what we don't see is when these things are coming. Now, the one possibility that I do see for a structure here, but it's outside of the idea of chronological structure, revolves around this portion of text being a complete picture of what we can expect to see in life. So, what's the number that we often associate with completeness or perfection in the Bible? 7? Yeah. And we see that starting with the days of creation, right, in the beginning, and then we see it played out numerous other times through the text. The only thing that I can see structure-wise that points to anything here other than the fact that it's just telling us what to expect is the fact that this is a list of 28 individual items. So there are 14 pairs, both of those being multiples, obviously, of 7 and divided by 7. I don't know for a fact that that is what it's being utilized for here, but it is my opinion that it's possibly done in that manner so to express the fact that this is a complete list of the types of things and the seasons of life that we can expect. Any questions or comments up to this point? All right, moving on. As mentioned earlier, this portion of text, this poem that we have describing what we can expect to encounter, is a part of a whole, a greater thought, this chapter 3 altogether. And I think we have to be careful because, as we mentioned, so often we hear these 8 verses read at funerals, and it's often done, and then we do, on a surface level, understand that these things are describing what we will all experience and what someone had experienced in their life, and that we are there because of their death. But when we pluck it away from the rest of the book, we are running a risk of pulling it out of context and not using it how the author intended it to be used. And I think we do that with a lot. And when I say we, I just mean mankind again in general, but I think we do that often with different portions of the Bible, and I don't believe that this portion is any different. For example, how many people in here can quote Philippians 4:13? It's a pretty good number of you. And so what does Philippians 4:13 say? Yeah, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, right? And which is a very important sentiment for us to have. However, in we'll call it the broader religious world, that phrase often gets used and applied to things that I believe are outside of the context of that verse. What we never see quoted is Philippians chapter 4 and verse 12. And I clearly, because I'm going to have to turn to it to read it to you. But Philippians 4 and verse 12 says, I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound in any and every circumstance. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. There Paul's telling us, and the people who he's writing to in Philippi, that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me in whatever circumstance life throws at me. It's not about I can score the touchdown on Friday night or I can hit the home run on Saturday morning. And I think that if we're not careful, we can do the same thing with this portion of text in Ecclesiastes. So that's why it will be very important on Wednesday night for us to look at exactly what verse 9 through 22 are doing to put these verses in perspective. But before we get to verses 9 through 22, there are a few other things that this set of text is highlighting that I think are important for us to take a look at. First, I think it shows us some insight into the complexity of life. This section skillfully illustrates the complex nature of our life under the sun. In one way it does this is it shows us that there are good and bad times. Some items on this list seem to indicate that there are good seasons and bad seasons in life. And some of the items here, such as a time for killing and a time for healing, a time for love and a time for hate, a time for war and a time for peace. I think that when we consider that list of things, there are things on there that we would automatically think of and think to ourselves that that is a time of hardship. That is a time of trouble. That is a bad season of life. However, the other things on that list, the healing and love and peace, we automatically associate with the polar opposite of that. But not everything on this list is telling us that it's going to be either good or bad. Some of the items on the list that we have here, they have a different end of the spectrum, but there's not necessarily a good or a bad connotation attached. So we see things such as a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to be silent and a time to speak. And so as we saw in chapter 1, the form of this poem helps to point to its meaning. Life is a very complex thing, full of good and bad times and all of the things that are in between. There are a whole host of choices that often seem to require wisdom that eludes us at the time that the choice is being made. But we are being told here that, in fact, there is a time for all of these things. So, besides the complex nature of life and the trouble that we can have sometimes in deciphering exactly what is going on, I think this portion of the text also highlights the fact that we are meant to be in relationships. So we are relational creatures. And I don't mean just specifically in the romantic sense of a relationship. I mean all the different types of relationships that we can have in this life. I mean, have any of you ever known anyone to have gone all the way through life without being in any relationships of any kind at all? The answer is clearly no, because no matter what, at least as a child, there's going to be some sort of relationship because you have to be cared for. And so many of the words here and these phrases that we see in this poem point to the fact that our time here is spent with others. And it seems to be highlighting how much we are connected to others during these different seasons of our lives. We are without question relational, and that can be seen in every one of our day-to-day lives. And these relationships have direct effect on whatever season of lives that we read in this list we can currently find ourselves in. We laugh with the ones who we will weep with. We dance with those who we will mourn later. And on that list goes. And we reach for the embrace of those who we will instinctively refrain from touching at a later time. If we were to remove relationships from our lives, things would be flat and monotonous. However, we see that some of the seasons that are highlighted here by our relationships, and we are being told that these seasons change. We can't always see the seasons of our lives reflected on our calendar that's on our phone or on our refrigerator or our wall. But oftentimes, these seasons of life are reflected by the fact that we are a son or a daughter or a wife or an employee or a mentor or a widow. These things, these parts of our relationships often highlight whatever cycle and season of life we are in. So we can't always see them, but our relationships often mark those for us. And these are the seasons that God has given us, and at least in part, they seem to be bound by the presence or absence of these relationships. Before we move on to this idea of being beyond our control, is there anything along those lines that anybody would like to comment on or ask about? Okay, so then in this text, we also get insight into the fact that things here are beyond our control, as we talked about one of our main lenses at looking at Ecclesiastes in this quarter. Life is full of flaws, as we see illustrated here. Some of the things that will come to us will be painful reminders that we, in fact, live east of Eden. A time for killing, a time for war, a time for tearing down, a time for mourning, a time for weeping, a time for hating. These things, combined with the fact that there is no indicator to when these times will come again and again, show us one of the main concepts in the book of Ecclesiastes. We are seeing that we have no control over these things, and so we're ultimately going to need to relent to the one who does. There is a time for everything, but we do not get to make the schedule. So, in light of that fact, what then can we do? Each aspect of the problem being highlighted in verses 1 through 8 point to one large problem. And this is why taking these verses as a standalone portion of text can cause more harm than good at times. In verse 9, which immediately follows verses 1 through 8, we see a question that has been posed and posed time and time again and will continue to be posed. What gain has the worker from his toil? So here we are with the preacher again raising the lens of death and preparing for our death to view how our life should be lived. This verse, or in the following verses, are never read at the funeral services that we mentioned. And that's because the point is, again, that nothing has been gained in our time here under the sun through our toil. It's interesting to me that if you look at the descriptors and what the first 8 verses are telling us, that this is a portion of text that could have just as easily probably been written by someone who was not a believer. This section of verse could be written by someone who had just observed life through their eyes and what they had experienced and what other people had experienced. But what we're going to see as we progress through the remainder of the chapter is how the author of the book, in conjunction with the Holy Spirit, is going to use these life experiences, these seasons in our life, to explain to us exactly how to live a life of hope and joy, and that even though we can't always make sense of these things, that they are there and in the proper time and place. As we looked at last week, one thing that we need to ask ourselves while reading Ecclesiastes is what separates its message from the nihilist expression, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And so that's what we're going to start to take a look at now, because starting in the next few verses of this chapter, we're going to see that concept fleshed out, and then it will continue to be fleshed out through the remainder of the book. I want for us now to open our Bibles back up and read the remainder of the text, and then we're going to start looking at the perspective in which we are to have while we're considering this poem that opens this book. Starting in we'll back up and read verse 9 again through the end of the chapter. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which already has been, that which is to be, already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes into the ground? So I saw that there is nothing better than a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? So we're going to look at these verses, and through these verses we're going to see the comfort and the challenge that we're going to use to understand more clearly verses 1 through 8. And just know that the comfort will outweigh the challenge. And let's talk about the comfort for a few minutes. So as we just saw in we read verses 9 through 22. After exploring all of the seasons of life that we encounter, and still being left to try to understand what gain comes from our toil, we start to get the message of hope and joy that this chapter has for us. We start to see a message that will be on display throughout the remainder of Ecclesiastes, and that is the times of our lives, as described in the previous poem, are not the only times that there are. Learning to live as a preparation for our death reveals to us that there is another time coming, and that it is a time of judgment. So that this time that we have here, this time that is encapsulated by these seasons of our life, these seasons of our life that at times make sense to us and at times don't. It's expounded on by this concept of there being wickedness in the halls of justice and wickedness where righteous should be. Though we may not understand how these things come and go, we may not understand the things that they allow to be played out in front of us, the time that we are looking forward to is the time of judgment, when everything that has been done, whether we understood it or not, will be brought into account. And this is, in fact, great news. This is the news of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 that will provide us with the hope and inspiration to continue to live as God-fearing people. It will give our everyday decisions and actions importance, meaning, and weight. And that is what we want to look at together on Wednesday evening. So thank you again for being here, and I will see you Wednesday night.